Hello everyone, I want to talk to you guys about masks. Masks were a huge point of contention in the years 2020 and 2021. They were a major hot button issue in the national discourse of America. Now, albeit the issue of masks was also a hot button topic in the European Union and in the UK, but I would say it was more so an issue of great acrimonious discussion in the United States. COVID popped up, as we all know, in the year 2020. It was a watershed year. It was a year that we will probably never forget because it was the first major pandemic that the United States and really the world had to seriously endure since the influenza epidemic back in the early half of the 20th century. And during the influenza epidemic, you had certain protocols that were instated by the government. Churches were closed down, businesses were closed down. There were controls that were imposed by the state on the conveniences that we all enjoy in normal life. So that was when influenza was a problem, and the world had to go through more or less the same experience with the coronavirus. The problem was that people, generally speaking, don't really know about this history. People, generally speaking, don't know about the types of lockdowns and protocols that were imposed during the influenza problem. And so people were acting as if this was the first time that such a thing had happened. People in 2020 were acting as though for the first time in American history, certain businesses, certain establishments had to be closed down because of a disease, because of a virus. So people were freaking out, and as we all know, 2020 was the year of toilet paper. It was the year in which people were fighting over ass wipe material. Very, very serious. It was pretty crazy. Amazingly, I remember talking to a friend of mine who lives in Scandinavia, and he told me, and this was back in 2020, he told me that Scandinavians were focusing more on purchasing flour than they were toilet paper, because they knew that if they were going to be stuck at home, they better have flour to bake bread, because food is very important. Yeah, right? Who would have thought? So, really, the certain aspects of the American soul were exposed in 2020 and 2021. And we really got a feel for how Americans would react to a governmental decree such as wearing a mask. Wear your mask, right? It makes sense. The coronavirus spreads from air droplets from people's mouths. It spreads from people's mucus from when they sneeze, or it spreads from people coughing into the air, and people get infected. So if you put on a mask, you protect the orifices on your face that would receive the virus, thus protecting your body and potentially your life. There were people complaining about how masks were a means of manipulation. There were people saying that masks were being worn by people who were brainwashed. If you wore a mask, in the eyes of these people, if you wore a mask, you were someone who was brainwashed and easily manipulated. And this was the narrative that was being pushed by a lot of people on the right-wing and libertarian side of the political spectrum. When the pandemic first began and COVID was very, very fresh and all the headlines were talking about nothing else but COVID, I literally wore a painter's mask. I had the type of mask that painters wear. That's what I was wearing. It's a little device. You strap it onto your mouth and nose, and it has it has what appears to be a gas mask, but it's actually to protect your cardiovascular system from inhaling paint. And I wore that thing every time I went to the grocery store for months. Every time I went to the grocery store, I wore that paint mask. And there were people looking at me as if I was crazy. Then I realized that the paint mask was a little too much, so I started wearing just the regular dentist mask, the regular medical mask that everybody else was wearing, and that was fine. And it protected your face. And a lot of businesses had rules that you had to wear a mask. Every grocery store that I went to had the rule you had to wear your mask. And if you did not wear your mask, you could not enter the business. And people were saying that this was manipulation, that it was brainwashing, that you were part of a cult, that you were a bootlicker or whatever. And so the people who refused to wear a mask, they were the enlightened ones. They were los iluminados, okay? They were the illuminated ones. They were the ones who were of a higher plane of intellect and understanding and awareness. Interestingly enough, across the globe, in the Orient, everyone wore a mask without much issue. Japanese people wore masks. In fact, decades prior to COVID, people in Northeast Asia were wearing masks because they were people who were afraid of getting sick. And I also think that it was partially a remnant of the fear that the SARS virus caused. Back in the early 2000s, China had the SARS virus. They had a problem with SARS, I remember, and everybody was talking about SARS back when I was in middle school. And I remember going to middle school, and there was one student who was walking around with one of those little N95 masks. Yeah, and that was back in like 2003, 2002. So there was at least one American back in the early 2000s who was wearing a mask in fear of getting SARS. But the Chinese all wear masks. Japanese people wore masks years and years and years prior to the COVID pandemic. And they had no issue with it. There wasn't this huge discussion on whether or not masks are a form of government manipulation in Japan. Japanese people just conformed, they obeyed, and they wore the mask. Now, for decades, every racist in the world has stated that the Japanese race is of a higher IQ than pretty much everyone else, and they'll say that Asians, Northeast Asians, have the highest IQ, so that would include Chinese people, Koreans. But they'll say that the Japanese people are of a higher IQ than the rest of the world, and that they have a superior IQ than white people, than Americans, and that this superior IQ is inherited genetically. And this is what racists have been saying for decades. But yet, you have people on the right-wing side of things in the United States and also in countries like Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, arguing that masks are a form of manipulation. What you're then arguing, or what you are implying, is that Japanese people are easily manipulated. So which one is it? Are they high IQ, or are they low IQ people who are easily manipulated? And all of the right-wingers who refuse to wear a mask are difficult to manipulate and have a higher awareness, a higher sense of awareness, and also a higher intelligence. Which one is it? Are Japanese people dumb people who are easily manipulated, or are the ones who refuse to wear the mask, are they low IQ and dumb, or the ones who refuse to wear a mask are the ones who refuse to wear a mask high IQ and not easily manipulated and have a higher sense of awareness? Which one is it? Right? Are Japanese people dumb because they're conformist and they obey their government, or are the Americans who refuse to wear masks dumb, or are they the ones who are intelligent? Or is it that Japanese people are more orderly, more law-abiding, less rebellious? And this really marks the difference between Easterners and Westerners. People from the Orient are more conformist, and they are also more collectivist. People in the West are more individualistic and also more rebellious. I have been reading this book. It is called The History of Civilization in Europe by Francois Guizot. And what Guizot talks about is, well, the title is quite self-explanatory. He talks about the origins of civilization in the Western world. And in the beginning of the book, he talks about the origins of the Western mind. And he talks about how the Western mind is very individualistic. Now, Guizot was writing this back in the early 1800s, early 19th century. So this is a time when the French Revolution was very fresh on the memories of the people. And the fact that he was saying that Westerners are individualistic and Easterners are collectivist in the early 1800s really goes to show how deep this difference is. This is not a difference that popped up recently. Ultra-individuality in the Western world is not something that is recent. It's actually something that is quite old, and this is what Guizot explains. So Guizot addresses the question, what is the origin of Western individualism? And he traces it all the way back to the Germanic people of Europe. You see, Guizot begins his history talking about the Roman Empire, how the Roman Empire controlled most of Europe. And the Roman Empire was extremely collectivist. The Roman Empire was extremely conformist. And the Roman Empire, the Roman culture, I should say, was very collectivist, very conformist. And the Roman Empire tried to enforce this conformity in its territories in Europe, albeit this proved to be very difficult. And Guizot points to the example of the Gauls being the ancestors of the French race, and Guizot being French, he would have a particular interest in that part of the ancient Roman Empire. He talks about how it was actually quite difficult for the Romans to control certain areas of the Gauls, or certain areas of Gaul, and certain tribes of the Gauls. It was difficult to control certain regions, and the Gauls weren't always obedient. They weren't always conformist. They wanted their freedom. They wanted to break free. And so when the Roman Empire fell, what crashed it, right? What crashed the Roman Empire? What devastated the western half of the Roman Empire was the Germanic barbarians. The Germanic barbarians from the north came down upon the Roman Empire and shattered it, destroyed the western half of the Roman Empire. And so what came after the fall of the Western Roman Empire was feudalism. Feudalism was the result of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And so instead of regions of Europe being controlled by the Roman government, they were now controlled by lords, by feudal lords. And you had the feudal lords, and underneath the feudal lords, you had the serfs, the peasants who worked under them. So there was no, in Europe, there were no countries really, and Europe was not broken down into countries as we see it today. Europe was broken down into various regions and fiefs and principalities, and they were controlled by lords and certain rulers, and the feudal lords had much of the power. The feudal lords were barbaric, and it was the church that would temper this barbarity, as Guizot explains. And so with the Germanic hordes came individualism. So Guizot talks about the difference between the Roman mind and the barbarian mind. The Roman mind was collectivist and conformist. The barbarian mind, people coming from the north, the Germanic peoples, they were more individualistic. Albeit they were more brutal, they were also more individualistic. Funny how people who are individualistic can also be more brutal than people who are collectivists, which really goes to show that just because a people is collectivist or conformist does not make them more tyrannical or more brutal than people who believe in individualism. People who believe in individualism can be sadists and they can be mass murderers. Just look at the French Revolution as an example. So this individualism that we see in the Western world is something that springs from the Germanic mind. It's something that springs from the North European mind. And maybe this explains why Sweden had literally no COVID lockdown. There was no COVID lockdown in Sweden. Out of all the European countries, Sweden had the most lenient. I think Sweden was the only country that just did not have any lockdowns. In Europe, that is. They didn't have any lockdowns. And they had the highest death rate in all of Northern Europe, in all of Scandinavia. And so a lot of people in Germany rebelled against the lockdown. People in the Netherlands rebelled against the lockdown. A lot of people in Canada, the United States, rebelled against the lockdown. And if you look at the Oriental peoples, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, there was much more conformity, albeit the Chinese did have a riot against the lockdown rules. That wasn't until the Chinese had conformed to it for quite some time. But nonetheless, the East is much more conformist than the West. So what always gets me is how Americans will get mad about a mask, right? A mask is the bare minimum of what you should do during a pandemic. Americans, conservative Americans, will get all upset, all uptight about a mask. But when Rabbi Dennis Prager says that the Bible says that you can be sexually satisfied with boys as you are with girls, conservatives don't get mad about that. Or you'll have Catholics who are upset about the mask protocol, but when someone tells them that their favorite priest is a child molester or a sexual predator, they will get upset at the person who warns them about their predator priest. So much for Western individualism. There is a lot of hypocrisy in all this stuff. And yeah, that's it. Which one is it? Are the Japanese super high IQ, or are they easily manipulated buffoons? Which one is it? Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.